It was a perfect day for walking. The paths were a rustling carpet of golden leaves, and the air hung heavy with the smell of dry brush and bonfires. Vanessa and Tayo were walking in the direction of the meadows, discussing Malcolm X's visit to Oxford. Vanessa was eager to hear the story of how a member of the West Africa Society had been instrumental in organising X's visit, while Tayo wanted to know from Vanessa what most English people, not just those at the university, thought about Malcolm X. Vanessa found Tayo's question challenging and felt torn between reality and her own idealism. "I wish that England was less racist than America," she said. "But then, when you have politicians like Enoch Powell saying the things he does, it doesn't really inspire hope." "It is discouraging," Tayo acknowledged, "but people do change, especially the younger generation, and I have hope in the British." Vanessa raised her eyebrows, wondering if he was just being polite, but he seemed not to have noticed her skepticism. Instead, he spoke about some of the encouraging interactions he'd experienced with school children and church groups. "Besides," he added, "in Yoruba, the meaning of my name is someone who brings joy, so I've got no choice but to be optimistic." She smiled, thinking that the name suited him. As they continued on their walk, Vanessa noticed that Tayo had a habit of picking up twigs that he would play with for some minutes, before sending them twirling away into the bushes. She liked the way he carried himself, so at ease in his body. It was obvious that he was clever and accomplished, yet in his manner he was humble, never once flaunting his knowledge in the way that she'd grown to dislike in men like Charlie and Mehul. Tayo also seemed to be more serious and less flirtatious than when she'd first met him, which prompted her to share something that had been bothering her. Oxford was a small place, and she preferred that Tayo should find out about her family from her and not from others. "I have a small confession for you, Tayo." "A small confession," she laughed, tapping him playfully on the shoulder when he stopped dead in his tracks. "I just wanted to say, well, do you remember when you asked me about my interest in Africa? I felt a bit embarrassed, in light of the debate that evening, to admit that I actually do have connections to Africa." "But why so embarrassed?" he asked. "Because," she hesitated, "well, because my father and grandfather were in the colonial service." They had stopped on a bridge and were leaning against a wooden railing, peering at the water flowing gently downstream. Two ducks paddled close to the riverbank, leaving room for a punter to glide silently past. And there, as they stood side by side, she told him about her father's colonial tours in West Africa. She chose her words carefully, hoping he wouldn't form a bad impression of her family, and, as a result, found herself saying more positive things than intended. It wasn't true that her father had been won over to the idea of African independence, so that when Tayo told her she ought to be more proud of her father, she felt guilty. "My father also worked in the British administration," Tayo said, as a way, Vanessa thought, of reassuring her. His father, he added, had been a court messenger in the 1950s and an interpreter in the native administration before becoming a policeman. His father had made many British friends, including some district officers. Tayo wondered whether their fathers might have met. "Perhaps," Vanessa replied, knowing this was doubtful. Her father did not fall into the category of colonial officers who were loved by locals, and she regretted misleading Tayo into thinking so. She hoped he would never have occasion to see the less attractive side of her father. At least she could count on father to put on a good act. For a few moments they walked in silence, in single file along the narrowing path. She wanted to ask Tayo more about his family, but didn't want to seem rude. So they talked instead about college and the people they knew. She hadn't realised how far they'd come until she saw they were nearly at the Trout, a country pub where she'd been several times before, but always by car, never on foot. Her feet hurt from her new boots, and she was weary. But Tayo didn't look tired at all. No doubt she told him because of all the sports he played. "Do you play any?" he asked. "No, not at all." "None?" "None," she said. "Is that bad?" "Terrible. Come on, let's run. I'll chase you to the Trout." "Oh no, I can't run." "Yes, you can," he tugged at her arm. "Last one buys the drinks." "Then I'm buying," she laughed, watching him crouch like a sprinter, waiting for her to start. She was breathing heavily by the time they got to the pub, and could only nod when Tayo offered to relieve her of her coat. He laughed, showing no sign of being short of breath. "My goodness, you are fit," she gasped. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "You heard me," she laughed. "What can I get you, love?" the bartender asked, interrupting their laughter. Vanessa ordered a beer, and Tayo a pineapple juice. They were looking around for a place to sit when two men passed in front of them and bumped into Tayo, spilling the drinks. "Do you mind?" Vanessa said crossly, when no one apologized. "Maybe the bloody wog ought to look where he's going. Maybe you two bloody idiots should learn some manners." "Just leave them," Tayo whispered, placing a hand gently on Vanessa's wrist. She started to protest, but he was restraining her, so she just stood, staring in shock. "It's fine," Tayo insisted, having put the drinks down so he could brush pineapple juice and beer off his cardigan. "Here, let me fetch you another." He reached for their half-empty glasses. "No, but thank you," she said, taking hers from him while she looked in the direction of the men. "Could we go outside?" They passed close to where the men now sat at the bar, beers in hand, and Tayo stopped. Alarmed, Vanessa tugged at his sleeve, but Tayo stood still, staring at the men until they were forced to look away. Outside, a smoky haze had fallen across the meadows, and squirrels darted across paths and up into trees. It was mid-afternoon, but the sun had already begun its descent, and a cold wind was lifting a pocketful of leaves and tossing them into the air. "Were you afraid?" Tayo asked, softly. "No," she lied. "I felt like punching them." "Ouch! Not such a gentle butterfly after all." "I tell you what," he said, smiling at her. "How about I give you a new name?" "A what?" "Something to capture your fighting spirit. How about Moremi?" "What's that?" "It means as tough as a nut, a little Miss Cassius Clay. Legend has it that Moremi saved the Yoruba kingdom." "Well, I'm not sure that Moremi, I'm not sure that's me, but Omotayo is certainly you." "Omotayo Oluwakayode," he added. "Oluwakayode is another of my joyful middle names." She looked up and found him smiling. "Do your names really mean what you say they do?" She started laughing. "Or is this how you like to charm the girls?" "Now why would I possibly wish to lie to you, Miss Moremi? I'm sincere, really sincere." "Okay," she laughed. "So what is Mr. Sincere doing over the Christmas holidays?" "Nothing that can't be changed," he said. "In that case, then, come to my grandparents' Christmas party." Chapter 7. Vanessa returned to London for the holidays. She slept through most of the journey, but woke as the train drew into Paddington and passengers with luggage began bumping their way down the aisles. She waited for others to get off before retrieving her 2 cases, dragging them down the steps and over the gap onto the platform where her parents were waiting. They looked older and shorter than Vanessa remembered, each wearing a tan raincoat, which was the first time Vanessa had known them to wear matching anything. Father's was open at the front, Mother's buttoned to the chin. Mother's hands were clasped around her handbag, as though grasping a horse's reins, fingers curled tightly around leather, hands drawn back close to the waist, while Father kept his arms folded over his chest in order to keep glancing at his watch, eager to get home. Traffic was slow around Paddington, but then it was a quick run through Brixton and Hernhill into leafy Dulwich. "It's lovely to be back," Vanessa said, pretending, for Father's sake, not to have noticed Mother's nervous chatter or the smell of whiskey on her breath. Vanessa knelt to remove the day's letters from the entrance so that Mother wouldn't trip, remembering having crouched by front doors as a child in eager anticipation of Father's letters. Usually he wrote on flimsy blue aerograms, but occasionally he remembered to send a white envelope with a row of colourful West African stamps that she then saved for her stamp collection. Juma and Saratu sauntered in, greeting Vanessa as though she'd only been gone for a few hours. They stepped nonchalantly between her feet, tickling her calves with the tips of their tails and arching their backs to better rub against her ankles. Soon the gentle patter of Mother's slippered feet summoned them down the stairs to the kitchen, and Vanessa followed to where the 2 felines waited in expectation of milk or a tin of something fishy. "I've made your favourite chicken pie," Mother said, standing by the oven, hands clasped in front of her tweed skirt. "Vanessa," Father called from the lounge upstairs, "I'll take your suitcase to your room, darling." It was just the 3 of them in the large, 3-story Georgian house, but already it felt crowded to Vanessa, crowded and cold. She glanced at her mother, standing by the oven, twirling her wedding band round and round like an anxious schoolgirl. Above the thick gold band sat a slimmer ring, pulled up to the knuckle to give room for the latter's rotation. This was her engagement ring, a large opal encircled by sapphires. Vanessa remembered touching the stones as a child, turning the ring this way and that to catch the many shafts of colour, and though Mother used to complain that opals brought bad luck, Vanessa never remembered her taking it off except when making pastry. "These are nice," Vanessa noticed the roses on the kitchen table. "I've made you a cake." Mother pointed to a linen tea-cloth covering her work. "Lemon pound," she added, turning away to fill the kettle. The sound of running water drowned Vanessa's thank you, as well as the whine of the cats. "Silly things," Vanessa muttered as she fetched the milk and dribbled it onto their saucers. She tried holding them back with a foot, but some of the milk landed on their faces and they shook their tiny heads, scattering milk droplets across the linoleum. Vanessa smiled as she placed the empty bottle on the work surface and watched them for a moment before going to her room. Her suitcase was waiting next to her bed, where Piglet, Tigger, and Paddington Bear sat propped up against the headboard, just as she'd left them. On her dressing table, Mother, or the housekeeper, had arranged pink carnations that smelt of nutmeg. Vanessa smiled and walked to the window overlooking Bellamy Boys' School playing fields. Scattered across the fields, patches of frosty grass, resembling clumps of silver tinsel, remained untouched by winter's sun. Home. The headmaster's house in Dulwich. At least, home prior to Oxford. But there had been so many houses before this one. First they had lived in Nigeria, and then she and Mother had come back to England, while Father remained abroad. It had been better, Vanessa mused, when it was just she and Mother in the days before Mother's drinking. She turned from the garden and ran her fingers along the edges of the floral curtains. This was a young girl's bedroom, and she missed the room in Oxford with its serious books, newspapers and ashtrays. But then she remembered Tayo's Christmas present and took it out of her bag to play. Shulia-bop, she sang, twirling to the music of Sarah Vaughan. She'd promised not to open his present before Christmas, but she couldn't resist, and what a lovely gift! What could she give him in return? She remembered the photographer's shop on Upper Street. She would get him a print of Louis Armstrong or Sonny Rawlings, or, failing that, she could always look for a first edition of The House at Pooh Corner. Tayo had introduced her to some of his favourite writers, so she would do the same, provided he didn't think Pooh too childish. She was still thinking of presents when she heard her mother calling and hurried downstairs. They were sitting at the dining table where Father was peering at his food and announcing that the pie was soggy in the middle. "Mum, it's fine," Vanessa insisted, trying to stop her from scooping up the servings and running to the kitchen, but it was too late. "So what does Oxford think of Harold Wilson?" Father asked. "I don't know," Vanessa shrugged. Father was stabbing peas with his fork and popping them into his mouth like a child, and this irritated her. Had it been anyone else, she would have spoken eagerly of the new Prime Minister, but she knew that he scorned Wilson and the Labour Party. Why couldn't he think of other things to discuss? "There's so much more than Wilson, Daddy. There's racism in the Midlands, apartheid in South Africa, American civil rights. That's what Oxford talks about." "Is everything okay?" Mother reappeared, carrying what now looked like burnt pie. "Yes, Mum," Vanessa nodded, staring at Father, ready for him to object. But he didn't say anything, and Mother started talking about preparations for the Christmas party, asking who Vanessa was inviting. "Better not be anti-apartheid people," Father grumbled. "Why?" Vanessa asked. "Well, because I've invited my mining friends." "You what?" Vanessa looked to her mother for support. "Oh, Nessa," Mother pleaded. "But they're horrible, those men. They own all the bloody mines in South Africa and make packets of money out of their black workers. How can you invite them? Do you know how many blacks die in the Kimberley mines every month?" "Vanessa, I think you're being silly," Father snapped. "Silly? It's not nearly as bad as the press is saying, so don't be taken in just because you're filled with the rush of Oxford, and if you look at the mess in the rest of Africa, South Africa's doing very well by comparison. Yes, thanks to all the blacks doing the work and being bloody exploited." Vanessa let her fork drop to the plate and pushed back her chair. "Look, I'm sorry, Mum, I can't take this." She ran upstairs and slammed her door shut before flinging the stuffed toys off her bed and jamming the pillow over her head. How dare he? She'd always known of Father's white South African friends, but how dare he invite them to a family party? What would Tayo and Gita think? "Oh, sorry, here's my father's racist South African chums. You don't mind, do you?" She sat up, wiped the tears from her face, and took a deep breath. She considered for a moment telling her friends not to come, but realised this would be what her father wanted, and she wasn't going to do that. It was Mother she wanted to introduce to her friends, not Father. But then what if Mother got drunk? "Oh, bloody hell," she moaned, banging her head against the pillow. Chapter 8. A male servant welcomed Tayo to Ajayi and ushered him into a brightly lit room, abuzz with the animated chatter of people mingling with drinks. Tayo looked for Vanessa but couldn't see her. Everyone was dressed in fine clothes and seemed at ease in the grandiose setting. Enormous chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and festive swathes of holly and ivy decorated the large bay windows. Waitresses in frilly white caps and starched aprons wove through the room, balancing silver trays on their fingertips. One stopped to offer Tayo a canapé, which he accepted with a glass of wine, and made as if to mingle, peering at flower arrangements or gazing at paintings until, to his relief, Vanessa appeared. She wore a midnight blue sequin dress that clung to her body all the way down to her ankles, where the material fanned out, hiding her shoes. She hugged him in greeting, which surprised him. "Come and meet my family." First, she introduced him to her grandfather, who had difficulty hearing, and started talking about India, before Vanessa was able to make him understand that Tayo came from Nigeria. Then the grandfather's eyes lit up as he launched into a series of stories about Lord Lugard and their family ties. Vanessa kept muttering apologies for her grandfather's unabashed support of the British, but Tayo didn't judge the old man for his colonial fervour. He was simply a man of his times, and it was clear to Tayo that he was generous at heart. Next was Vanessa's mother, whom Tayo found charming and strikingly beautiful. She chatted to him about Nigeria, saying how much she missed the country and its people. She wanted to know how he was finding England. If the evening had ended there, it might have been a perfect party for Tayo. But meeting Vanessa's father was less than enchanting. It didn't help that one of his South African friends mistook Tayo for a servant. The meeting with Vanessa's best friend also seemed odd to Tayo. Vanessa had described Jane as shy, but he had an uncomfortable feeling that she was flirting with him whenever Vanessa wasn't around. But perhaps he was only imagining it. Sometimes shy people could be socially awkward, he reasoned. At any rate, he was glad when the party was over. Vanessa had told him beforehand that he could spend the night at her grandparents' home, and all evening he had been dreading sharing with one of the South Africans. But he need not have worried. The house was big enough for him to have a room of his own. His room was large, with beautiful antique furniture, but it had no fireplace, so Tayo was thankful for the woolens he'd brought to wear beneath his pyjamas. The cotton pyjamas were hardly appropriate for winter, but his mother had sewn them, and he treasured them, even though their Nigerian flag green and white stripes had faded to lime grey. He also wore 2 lamb's-wool cardigans, an extra pair of socks, some gloves, and his Balliol scarf. He did a few jumping jacks to get warm, and then sat down with the intention of writing to his father. He stared at the paper in front of him, knowing what his father would like to hear, but delayed while his mind wandered back to thoughts of Vanessa. At least Vanessa's mother seemed to like him, so that was a good sign. She'd seemed pleased with the thorn carvings and sherry he'd brought as gifts, making room to display them on one of the tables. "Isn't he delightful?" he overheard her saying to her husband, who, he suspected, did not share her opinion. In which case, Tayo muttered aloud, I'd better stop thinking about his daughter. He stood up and, still feeling cold, took the blanket from his bed and wrapped it around his shoulders. He removed a glove and wrote the date, remembering that this time last year he'd been with Christine. He hadn't spoken to her for several weeks, but knew that she and Ike would be spending the holiday together. Dear Baba, I'm writing this letter to you from Ablaze, the family home of a fellow student. I've learnt that it is a custom here for country houses to be given names. Tayo paused. The words fellow student made Vanessa sound like she was nothing out of the ordinary, but he knew father might still question it. The fact that his son had not written for several weeks, plus the sudden mention of a woman, was likely to signal something, even though, for the moment at least, the relationship had been quite innocent. They'd seen each other several times over the holidays, but all that had taken place was friendly teasing and the normal flirting. However, if Tayo were being honest with himself, there was something more. The fact, for example, that she'd been on his mind for much of the night, and that he'd cared about what her family thought of him. He was also pleased that her friends, Mehul and Charlie, were not there. Miss Richardson is a student at Oxford who is interested in Africa and has invited a group of us to her grandparents' home for the Christmas celebrations. The home is spectacular, more than 200 years old, with 7 bedrooms as well as stables and servants' quarters. It belongs to Grandpa and Grandma Hume, Vanessa's mother's side, who lived in India for many years. Grandpa Hume was in the army, as was his son-in-law, Mr. Richardson, who later served in Sierra Leone and in our own country in the northern province. Tayo wondered what his father would have thought of the likes of Mr. Richardson. Father always spoke with pride of his years in the native administration, but surely it must have been irritating to serve younger British men who knew so little yet felt naturally entitled to power. For a moment, Tayo considered telling father the names of some of the artists and politicians who'd been at the party. But the more he named, the more he would have to account for later. He'd already made the mistake of telling father that the former Prime Minister's grandson resided in college. Ever since he'd been hounded by questions as to the possibility of a visit to the Macmillan home. He was about to write something else when he heard a knock on his door. "One moment, please," Tayo called, jumping up as he pushed the blanket off his shoulders, throwing it back on the bed. He glanced at his watch. Midnight. Quickly, he removed his scarf and tugged at his gloves, wondering what to do with the rest of his layers when the knocking resumed. "Tayo, it's me," came the whisper. He opened the door a crack. "Oh, Vanessa, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was you." He opened the door wider, wondering if he ought to ask her to wait while he changed. But what would he change into? He had no decent pyjamas, not even a dressing gown. He ought to have heeded the British Council's advice on what clothes to buy for England. Vanessa still wore her lovely dress, now covered at the neck by a mohair stole. "May I come in?" she whispered again, pushing her face closer. Yes, of course, come in," he stammered, feeling foolish for keeping her waiting. They now stood awkwardly in the middle of the room while she tugged at her stole. "I hope you weren't too disappointed," she said. "Disappointed?" "Well, it's just that my father, especially when he's with those friends, can be dreadful." "Oh, please don't worry about that," he smiled. "Come, please sit." He pointed hesitantly to his bed, which didn't quite seem the decent thing to do, but it was the only place to sit apart from the chair, and that was cluttered with his things. "Please, sit." He straightened the blanket. "If you'll excuse me, I'll just change into something more appropriate." "No, really, I mustn't disturb you, and I see that you're working." Tayo watched her as she moved back towards the door, stepping so as not to make a noise on the floorboards. He guessed from the way she wobbled on her heels that she was not used to them. Tall women rarely wore them. He smiled as she tried, unsuccessfully, to creep gracefully away until he remembered his own fluffy green slippers bulging at the sides from the extra layers of socks. "I must look ridiculous," he said, abandoning all thoughts of a change now. "You look perfectly handsome, as always, Tayo," she smiled. "And you, Vanessa, look like a lady of the night." "A what?" "No, I'm just being silly," he laughed. "Please, stay." She sat on his bed, and he moved the chair from the desk, placing it near the bed. "Seriously, you look lovely tonight, Vanessa. I mean, you always look lovely, but tonight even more lovely, if that's possible." "Oh, Tayo, stop." "So," he said. "So," she answered, "I'm just embarrassed by my father." "We all get embarrassed by our parents, it's normal," Tayo replied. "Besides, if I were your father, I think I'd be wary of any young man near my daughter too." "Well, I'm sure your parents are wonderful," Vanessa replied. "Will you tell me about them?" She wanted to know especially about his mother, and so he told her what he thought she'd find interesting, beginning with his mother's profession as a cloth trader. "And what does she look like?" "She's slender," he said, "so she wraps towels around her waist to make herself look bigger." Skinny, he had to explain, was not considered beautiful, and then he remembered having seen Vanessa at Charlie's party with a towel wrapped around her waist too, which made her laugh. He was enjoying telling Vanessa about his family and found it easy to talk to her. She seemed genuinely interested in what he was saying. Even though she didn't understand everything about where he came from, she was so far removed from his culture and so intrigued by it that Tayo felt no need to embellish his childhood, as he'd sometimes done with Christine. He even felt comfortable enough to admit that his mother was one of several wives. "4?" Vanessa repeated. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound surprised, but—" "No, you mustn't apologize. It's permitted, and when my father became a Christian, well, he couldn't easily change his marital status." "And did you live together in one place or in different locations? Do you mind me asking?" He liked the fact that Vanessa wanted to learn more, except that now she was looking puzzled. "I was just thinking," she explained. "In one sense, you could argue that polygamy is not terribly different from people here in England marrying, divorcing, and then remarrying. Only in one situation the marriages are simultaneous and in another consecutive. But do you think your mum's happy, to have other wives around? Am I asking too many questions?" "No, not at all," he smiled. "Yes, I do think my mother is happy. She's certainly very independent. In fact, you could almost say she practiced a form of polyandry because she left my father for a time to be with another man. It was when I was a boy, so I don't know the full story, but a year or two later she returned to my father. Maybe it happened because my father decided to make the family Christian. I'm not sure." "It's so interesting. I'd love to meet your mother one day." "Then you will. She's also quite jovial, just like you," Tayo added. "And what else can I tell you about her?" "Well, she carries the tribal marks on her face, like my father, 3 parallel marks on each cheek, from cheekbone to jaw." "What are you thinking?" he asked, watching her smile lift in its sensuous way, a little higher on one cheek than the other. "I'm thinking you'll marry someone like your mother because isn't that what they always say, that a man looks for someone like his mother?" "And a woman? Does she look for someone like her father?" he asked, alarmed as he considered Mr. Richardson. "I certainly won't, at least not someone as conservative as my father." All this time she'd been tugging at her hair, so that now most of it had fallen in loose curls onto her shoulders. More than ever, Tayo wanted to touch her. He moved from his chair to the bed, close to where she'd slipped her feet beneath the blanket. "I almost wish that my mother had had the polyandry option that your mother had," Vanessa added, looking more serious. "Why?" "Maybe it happens in all marriages at some point, and this sounds awful, but I just think mother would be happier with someone else." For a few moments, Vanessa sat lost in thought as she ran her pretty fingers along the embroidered edge of the pillowcase. "You don't have to stop," Tayo whispered. Vanessa sighed as though she were tired, but then she sat up and patted the pillow. "So, what suits Tayo Ajayi? You never told me. Polygamy or monogamy?" "I note the absence of polyandry," he remarked. "Somehow, I didn't think you'd go for that," she laughed. "Oh, I don't know. I quite like the idea of getting other men to fix things around the house. I'm not good at that. But as for the sexual part," Tayo laughed. "Well, no, I couldn't share my woman. I'm afraid I'd be too jealous. Monogamy, happy monogamy, I think that's what I would pick. And it would have to be a woman who is gentle and loving. Someone intelligent, able to put up with me, of course, and God-fearing. What do you think? God-fearing or Tayo-fearing? Now, why should anyone fear me?" "I don't know," she laughed, "but it's late and I should be going." "Afraid?" "No, it's been lovely," she smiled, pulling her feet away from the blanket and rubbing her bare arms. "Lovely," he repeated, sensing that this was the moment to do something, if he was going to do anything, but given where they were and the fact that her father was somewhere nearby, he hesitated. She stood up, slipped her shoes on, and took the stole from where it had fallen next to the pillow. "Don't catch cold," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. He watched as she slipped out of the room and tiptoed down the hall. "What's wrong with you?" he muttered to himself, slowly closing the door. "Ode," he cursed himself, in Yoruba. Chapter 9. On Monday, they shared walnut cake at the Kadina. Tuesday, they ate chicken curry at the Taj Mahal restaurant. Wednesday, they drank coffee in her room, and Thursday they attended St. Anthony's weekly seminar on African theatre. They'd considered going to the Moulin Rouge on Friday to see Zimmerman's High Noon, but decided instead to stay in Tayo's room and listen to jazz. Vanessa loved the smell of his room, a comforting mix of Old Spice, Brill cream, and Nigerian food. Occasionally, when they were not together, she would catch the scent on Tayo's letters or on clothing he had touched. His room was on the first floor of staircase 16, large and sparsely furnished. In it was a bed with 3 neatly folded blankets, 2 green and 1 cream, and at the far end of the room a fireplace boarded over and replaced with a coin-operated heater. The heater was always on when Vanessa visited, and she suspected he rarely turned it off. He had told her that in his first week at Oxford he'd nearly set himself on fire by sitting too close to it. The only other items of furniture were his old oak desk by the window, the sofa where she now sat, a wardrobe, and a coffee table. On the floor were his football boots, and propped up against the bit of wall between the windowsill and desk was the room's only decoration, 2 colour postcards of ocean liners. Today she'd brought him daffodils to brighten the room. Women can bring men flowers too, you know. She smiled, sensing his hesitation, as she arranged them in an empty milk bottle. Already the buds were opening and adding a bright splash of buttery yellow to his room. She placed them next to the neat stack of books and papers, and then picked up the one that was marked A Handbook for Students from Overseas. She studied what he'd underlined and smiled as she read aloud from the section on Habits and Customs. It says here that when 2 people meet and they wish to save themselves from the embarrassment of silence, they usually talk about the weather. Did we talk about the weather when we first met? I believe we did. No, we didn't, she laughed, closing the book and picking up another. A Dance of the Forest by Wole Soyinka. Soyinka, he corrected her. Any good? She asked, watching him take the record player from its box on the floor. While his back was turned, she tugged at her skirt, which, despite Pat's reassurance, was, she now decided, too short. Where do you buy all these Nigerian newspapers? My father sends me some, and others I get from London. Preparations well underway for the first Negro Festival of Arts, she read. Wouldn't you love to go? Look, she held up the paper for him to see. Everyone's going. Haile Selassie, Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, Marapesa Dawn. So let's go, and we'll sail the Oriole. You know, I think I might already have sailed on that ship when Mum and I came back to England. I'm sure it had a yellow funnel, just like the one in your postcard. I knew it. Knew what? That you were the girl on the ship, the day I first saw the Oriole in 1951. Well, then it wouldn't have been me, not in 1951. But your mother was lifting you up like this, Tayo demonstrated, flexing his muscles. And I waved to you. Actually, no, that wasn't it. I remember now. You blew me a kiss, and I sent you one back, he said, matter of fact, as he leant against his desk, resting the record against his knees. Tell me more then, Vanessa smiled. Well, to set the scene, it was before the days of Father's Morris Minor, so we took the Bolekaja bus from my hometown in Ibadan to Lagos. These are the typical Bedford trucks, the type you find here in England, carrying goods or livestock, but in Nigeria they're fitted with benches to carry passengers. Do you remember them? No, she shook her head. Well, the buses are not very advanced, which means that everything travels on them, people, children, goats, chickens, you name it. Combine this with hours of driving on dirt roads full of potholes, and you get some pretty irritated passengers, not to speak of the rude busboys. That's how the buses get their name. Bolekaja literally means, come down and let's fight it out. She laughed, picturing the scene with Tayo on one of these buses, though it was hard to imagine him ever getting angry as she watched him twirl his record in the air. When we got to Lagos, my father took me straight away to the ocean, and I screamed. I never expected the sea to look so vast and sound so loud. I thought the tide and all that foam were about to swallow us up, but somehow Baba must have calmed me, and we spent hours watching the water and the ships. The next day, we watched the Oriole leave, and you were on that ship, I'm sure of it. So you see, we were destined for each other. He jumped up, causing her heart to skip a beat. And now that we've spent an evening going to Africa and back, as Christopher Robin would say, how about this, Miss Vanessa? She watched as he twirled the disc on his index finger and blew imaginary dust from both sides before placing it on the record player. Little things like this, his gestures and the way he moved, had the strangest, most thrilling effect on her. And there were other things too, that she would normally never notice and admire, but with him it was different. His tidiness, for example, the way he organised his jazz LPs in one pile and West African high life in another, all stowed away at the bottom of his wardrobe. Initially, it had been his gentleness and a sense that he was genuine that had attracted her. And of course, there had always been his looks. But now there were these conversations, the things he was teaching her, the way he listened. She loved his attentiveness and the way he made her laugh. There he was, happily singing along with Louis Armstrong, and it didn't matter if he didn't like Bob Dylan or the Beatles. He marched in exaggerated steps, still singing, "Oh Lord, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in." You do put me in a good mood, Tayo. That's good. I'm here to please. Omo Tayo, remember? The man who brings joy. Come, he beckoned. Dance with me. She watched as he pushed up his sleeves to reveal the fine muscles in his forearms, which again set her heart aflutter. I'll just watch, she said, knowing there was no way she could move with his ease or flair. She would end up stepping on his feet. Okay, as you please. If you don't want to dance, then I'll just have to tell you the Satchmo story. No, stop, she laughed, tossing a cushion at his legs. You've told me that story so many times that I've memorized it. In 1961, Satchmo played on the Ikorodu Road at Bobby Benson's club. The place was packed, and you were so proud to see a gifted American Negro inspired by the beats of Africa. So proud that you will personally write Satchmo's biography one day. I will, he laughed. So you see, next time you should dance, and then you won't have to listen to my stories. But first, I'm making you coffee. He lifted the stylus back to the beginning of the song and marched off, humming. Vanessa smiled to herself as she waited, remembering the first time that Tayo had talked to her about Satchmo's visit to Nigeria, and she imagined herself as the reporter. She'd always wanted to be a foreign reporter in Africa, but now she wasn't so sure. Malcolm X had been so critical of white journalists there. Tayo returned with the coffees and asked about her day, so she told him about the little things, the struggles with her work and her continuing aversion to college food. I'm sorry, he said, looking concerned and then offering more of his mother's food. You're such a love, she wriggled to the edge of her seat, touched by his concern. Africans, she had noticed, were in the habit of saying sorry even if something wasn't their fault. And then he looked down at where she had tapped his knee, and she blushed. What's the essay that's causing you all this headache, he asked. American slavery, secession, and the old Lincoln-Douglas debates, she answered, clasping both hands around the mug. The topic is interesting, but it's not modern history. I keep thinking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, as well as everything that is happening in South Africa. You know, real modern history. So you must write about these things, find a way of putting them in your essay, and then submit more articles to the newspapers. You think so? She clasped her mug a little tighter, watching the bits of cream bob up and down in the circle of coffee. She wondered what Tayo was really thinking. Of course you should write, Vanessa. You have a flair for writing, and you already have your own unique voice. She smiled, gazing at him for a safe moment. She loved the way he pronounced her name. Vanessa, he said, with the accent on the V, making it sound strong and exotic. And now I have a new song for you. He took her mug and placed it next to his on the desk. Listen to this. He shook another record out of its sleeve. Who is it? Listen. Ella? She guessed. No. Lena Horne? No. Who, then? She jumped up and snatched the sleeve from his hands. Hey, he laughed, chasing her back to the chair. What a Little Moonlight Can Do, Billie Holiday, she read the label, holding it up high out of his reach. But it doesn't sound like her, it's Happy, she said, handing it back. Let's hear it again? He lifted the stylus and placed it on the record. She thought he was going to join her on the sofa, but instead he moved the coffee table and brought his chair closer to hers. So which Billie Holiday songs do you remember, he asked. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. I can't really remember the titles, but there were some songs that Mum was always listening to when Father was still in Nigeria. It must have been lonely for her. Vanessa nodded. One day she would tell him about Mother's struggles, but not now. Will you show me a photograph of your mother? Of course. He stood up and took an envelope from his drawer, and then, choosing one of the photographs, he began pointing out who was who in the photograph that was taken on the day he left for England. Vanessa nodded, taking the black and white print from his hand for a better look. In the picture, Tayo's head was tilted, looking up and smiling as though there was something interesting on the roof of the photographer's studio, while his brother, B, kept an eye on the little sister. B, wearing a smart checkered shirt, unbuttoned at the neck, was handsome too. His little brother, Remy, was the only person staring solemnly into the camera, and he wore traditional clothes like his mother and sister. His tiny hand rested on his mother's lap, next to her jeweled fingers and wrists. His mother wasn't smiling, just looking into the camera, wearing her head tie, or gele, as Tayo called it, which stood tall and made her look regal. What a proud-looking mother, Vanessa thought. His sister, Bisi, was grinning at the photographer, too young to be flirting, though it looked like that was precisely what she was doing. And your father? Tayo passed her another picture. Your photographers must instruct everyone not to smile, she laughed, noting the seriousness in the father's face. 3 tribal marks ran deep across each cheek. Tayo didn't resemble his father at all, only the eyes with the thick eyebrows. Any more? She asked. That's it. Oh, come on, she tugged at the envelope. It's only a football photograph and one of Christine. She's here at Oxford, as you know, but she's related to our family, he explained, letting her look for herself. I didn't know that, Vanessa felt relieved, staring at Christine's beautiful dark eyes and the perfectly arching eyebrows. Her skin was smooth and her hair swept up high in a Sophia Loren style. She could have been a model. How is she related to you? Well, sort of like a cousin, Tayo said, standing up to change the record. After a while, she placed the photographs on his pillow. Tayo, can I ask you something? Anything you like. Do you think I could be a journalist? Absolutely. Besides, you're a journalist already, and a fine one at that. No, but I mean a real one. Could I write about Africa, I mean? Not so much could I write, but would I be accepted? Why not? Of course you would. Vanessa Richardson, he said, writing her name in the air. Africa correspondent, I can see it already. Even if I'm white? And what's wrong with being British? Well, it's just that with all this talk of indigenization, I mean, I do understand and I do know it's important, but... Vanessa, my friend, Africa needs as many good journalists as it can get, African and British. There's so much to be done in our continent, and you would be perfect. She turned, accidentally brushing her leg against his as he sat down beside her. What will you play next? She asked, trying not to blush when he stroked her knee. What would you like? He reached for her hands. Anything, she whispered, as he gave her hands a gentle squeeze before letting go. I'll surprise you then. He stood up to change the record and stretched out an arm. Come, he whispered, this time offering his hands. She reached for him, and he pulled her up. Her heart was thumping, and her feet shuffled clumsily as he wrapped one arm around her waist and then the other, moving her away from the chair with the first notes of Ellington and Coltrane's In a Sentimental Mood. She rested her head against his chest and closed her eyes, allowing her body to sway a little to the music. He kissed the top of her head, and after a while let go of her waist. He placed warm hands against her cheeks and lifted her face to his. She wanted to kiss him, but her heart was pounding so loudly that she found herself turning away out of embarrassment. Gently, he placed her head back on his chest and kept on dancing. Chapter 10. Simon suggested that they spend Easter in Paris. His uncle Rupert owned an apartment that they could use while he was away holidaying in Guadeloupe. Simon would take his girlfriend, Nina, and Tayo would take Vanessa. Tayo liked the idea, but doubted whether Vanessa's father would let her spend a week away from home in the company of men. He need not have worried. English fathers were either not as strict as their Nigerian counterparts, or their daughters were more cunning. The apartment was located in the fashionable 9th arrondissement, close to the Place de la Madeleine, in an affluent area of the city, where women wearing furs and carrying miniature dogs strolled the Place Vendôme and Champs-Élysées. The women amused Tayo, for he could tell that being seen was just as important to them, if not more important, than what they purchased. What would it be like, he wondered, to sit and watch their comings and goings? And what would his mother make of them? But he and Vanessa never stayed long enough to observe, and except for a visit to the opera and an evening of coffees and millefeuilles at the Café de la Paix, they spent little time in the 9e. Instead, for the first few days, they walked through the Jardin des Tuileries onto the Seine and over to the left bank, which was Vanessa's favourite part of the city. Paris was a place Vanessa knew well, as she had visited it many times as a child, and on their walks she recounted, for Tayo's benefit, its history. She explained to him the origin of the Ile de la Cité and the distinctive architectures along the Seine. It was Tayo's first visit, and each day he found himself newly impressed by its beauty. It made him want to travel to as many European countries as possible before returning to Nigeria, and especially to the famous cities of Vienna, Prague, and Amsterdam. In a strange way, France reminded Tayo of Nigeria, even though in its appearance it was quite different from anything back home. The buildings were old, the diet rich in dairy products, and the climate cool, but in its feel was something reminiscent of home. It might have been the bustle, the incessant talking, and the way people argued on the street. The bureaucracy was also excessive, like home, and there were many Africans, French-speaking ones. Vanessa had brought him his first writing journal to record his thoughts, which he began doing on their first day. Today I can't stop smiling. I imagine walking with you forever, hand in hand, strolling through the Jardin de Luxembourg. It seems like we could laugh and talk and never run out of things to say. This afternoon, as we sipped our café au lait at Les Deux Magots, and as you charmed the propriétaire with your fluent French, I watched you with such pride. I love you, Vanessa, so much that I think of nothing else. Tomorrow we will visit new places, but it hardly matters where we go. Just to be with you is heaven. The next day, however, was not so romantic, for while Tayo and Vanessa were out on the streets of Montmartre, a Congolese man approached them and asked to take a photograph. I'll make a beautiful picture. You give me your address, mademoiselle, and I send it to you. Rubbish, Tayo thought. It was obvious that the man had other intentions, and yet Vanessa gave him her address. Tayo was quiet for the rest of the afternoon and felt annoyed because Vanessa could not see for herself what was bothering him. It grew into a long, simmering argument that would only be forgotten the following morning as they walked to the Sorbonne down the Rue des Écoles in search of Présence Africaine. In the tiny bookshop filled with books by African and Caribbean authors, Tayo thought not for the first time about Christine and how much she would have liked the place. Out of guilt, he bought her a copy of the Revue Présence Africaine, with special essays in tribute to Malcolm X. He also bought some work by James Baldwin, which he would later read with Vanessa, together on a park bench. And this was the pattern of each of their days, long stretches spent wandering Paris, followed by evenings with Simon and Nina. They lived the bohemian life, eating baguettes with brie and saucisson and drinking red wine as they debated world politics. They spoke of America, of Malcolm's tragic death, and of Vietnam. Vanessa and Simon argued against American intervention, while he and Nina played devil's advocate. On the final night, they talked for hours on the subject of society and who was best placed to critique it. Vanessa suggested that only those who had travelled away from home could really see their countries for what they were, which inevitably led them to Herodotus and de Tocqueville. Tayo wondered how he would perceive Nigeria once he returned. Would he see things more clearly? And what, as a foreigner, were his thoughts on England? What insights might he have to offer? The next morning, on their last full day in France, they were to visit Versailles and were packing a picnic. They were almost ready to leave when the telegram arrived. Christine was dead. Suicide. It had been an overdose, and the body was found only several days later by the cleaning lady. Ike was the one who gave Tayo the details over the phone, telling him that relatives had come immediately to take the body away and clear out her room. Why did she do this? Ike kept asking. Tayo did what he could to reassure him, telling him that these were questions no one could answer, but inside he asked the same questions and more. Everyone believed that things between him and Christine had ended long ago, but in reality it had been only a few weeks since Tayo had stopped visiting her. She had sent him several notes that he'd ignored as his relationship with Vanessa had grown more serious. Now he felt devastated. Even though there was nothing in the notes to suggest desperation, Tayo felt that had he responded to them, the suicide wouldn't have happened. Christine had told him many times that she felt caught between two lands, never fully belonging to England or Nigeria. But he had never taken it seriously, always thinking that she was the strong and privileged one. But now he could see it, the peripatetic lifestyle contributing to her anxieties at Oxford and amplifying her desire to please her family with academic success. But the taking of her life, how could she have done this? Why hadn't she talked to someone? And how had they all failed to realize the depth of her despair? He asked himself why he hadn't been honest enough to tell her that he wasn't ready for a serious relationship, instead of making up excuses he knew she hadn't believed anyway. Why hadn't he been more of a man and told her that he had once loved her, but that his feelings towards her had changed and now he was in love with Vanessa? That perhaps his motivation for resuming things with Christine and not making a clean break was selfish? He'd felt flattered that she needed him and pleased that Ike couldn't have her. He hadn't been honest with her or with himself. And now he was caught up in another web of untruths. He had lied to Vanessa about Christine. He still had Christine's notes. He couldn't at first bring himself to reread them, yet some of her words were already stamped in his brain. Bolaji tells us you are busy with your new girl. Please spare a few moments for your old friend. The notes sat on his Oxford desk, and, next to them, the journals that he brought for Christine in Paris. He flicked through them, tears welling in his eyes, as he realized that she might have already been dead when he bought them. And then he thought of Vanessa, who would by now be back in France for the summer, how patient she'd been as he grieved for Christine. She's not what you think, he found himself mumbling as though Christine were with him. Vanessa's not just any white woman. He was supposed to be packing his things to spend the summer with his cousin in Bradford, a trip he had planned months before, but he couldn't bring himself to start. Instead, he sat before his empty trunk, grieving for Christine, missing Vanessa, and staring at the Nigerian newspaper cutting sent by his father. Christine Arinze, who died of sudden illness while studying abroad at Oxford University. May her soul rest in peace. April 4th, 1965. Rest in peace, Tayo whispered.